Can you see me? Oh, there I am.
Yes.
All right. Cool.
Now we can see.
All right. Perfect. Thank you so much. And thank you for this opportunity, colleagues, for enabling me to speak on this very important meeting, which is also discussing a very important matter that is really affecting our region and the world at large at this moment of time. I think it's a historical thing. I received the invitation, and I think I was requested to give a lecture for 40 minutes or something like that. I'm not sure actually if I've ever lectured in my life, but I'll try, because all I'm doing is sharing really our experiences as OSISA in terms of what we have done so far, during the pandemic, what we have been able to prepare and how we have been able to respond to the pandemic. So this is really what I'm going to do. And I hope that I'll be able to, complete the discussion within the time frame. I believe I've only been given 40 minutes to do this. I also want to say that I'm very sorry for not being able to join earlier. It would have been very interesting for me to also learn from other colleagues, but I think that other OSISA colleagues were there, and hopefully they can then bring that information to enrich what we are doing at OSISA. It's just because we're in the middle of a great global-wide transformation, and all leadership have meetings on Friday from 11 to 1 p.m. But today, unfortunately, we went much over that time. There was just so much to discuss. So without really wasting much time, I'll just go straight to sort of introduce who OSISA is. Some of you might have heard about us or might have even interacted with us or might have worked with us. But basically, we are the Southern Africa arm of a foundation called the Open Society Foundation, which at the moment is still based in New York. So our chapter is called the Open Society Initiative for Southern Africa. And like Dr. Ade introduced me, I am the programs director there. So very quickly, just to let you in on what we do, I'll just go straight to our strategic plan, which at the moment we have 4 pillars of program work. Some of you may want to call it thematic work. It's actually a brand new strategy. We are just going to start implementing it now. It's part of the reason also that I've been very busy. It's because we are trying to get out some grants to quickly start in the implementation of the strategy. So the 4 pillars of our work, the first one is really around confronting autocracy, corporate power, and state capture. And here, all we are doing really is mobilizing, citizens, groups, and so forth to be able to fight the rising corporate and autocratic impunity within the region. And I think many of us will attest to that. The second objective is really about challenging inequality and promoting a just and inclusive society, where we want to ensure that these societies are sustainable, but we also are putting together tools and so forth on how to ensure that we level up, in terms of social and economic stance of our various groups and people, within the region. The third one is got to do with promoting and protecting constitutionalism and human rights. I think you also all agree with me that, constitutions, especially in this region, have suffered a lot, in the last decade and even more. And human rights are also not being upheld as they should have been. So that is our pillar. That is also that one of the, the basic strategic objectives of OSISA. And then the final one is really about democratizing access to information and promoting digital rights. And here what we are saying is that information is not just for, a preserve of a few people, but that indeed information should be a tool that is available to everybody to use, particularly for the purpose of, enhancing their lives and improving their lives. So that is really about OSISA. And now what I'm going to do, can you hear me?
Yes, we can hear you.
Oh, okay. Yeah, I just, sometimes my network kind of acts up, so I just need to be sure. I'll be asking you from time to time if you can hear me. So without wasting much of our time, I will go straight into the COVID strategy. So our work in response to COVID-19, came or is born out of a strategic plan that we developed as soon as the pandemic hit. At that time, I think we were preoccupied with trying to deliver and finalize our strategy then. But sooner or later, we realized that, look, we cannot continue to do our normal work because the pandemic had hit us in such a way that it was clear that we could not do anything that we had planned for in a way that we wanted to do. Very quickly, we began experiencing, closeouts of borders, closeouts, of spaces and so forth. And we realized we need to put together something that will help us to, systematically and strategically respond to this situation, because very clearly we saw that this is not a situation that was going to be there just for 3-4 days. It was going to take longer than we thought. So this is the strategy really that I am presenting, not the strategy. I am presenting what came out of the strategy and what we did out of the strategy. When the pandemic hit, we really thought that, we would only be responding to very conditional issues around, ensuring that, the health and lives of people are protected. So we started by going into our initial grants actually went out very quickly to support hospitals, groups, people around the region in, procuring things like masks, procuring things like, sanitizers and so forth. But sooner or later, we began to realize that, the pandemic was taking on a social political angle to it. And this made us realize that, look, actually, in as much as we thought that, COVID-19 would divert our focus from our strategy and concluding our strategy. In fact, what started happening as a result of the pandemic very much mirrored the concerns that we have, the systematic concerns that we have about open society. So we began to see spaces closing up. We began to see governments being very instrumental. We began to see, groups of people, various people groups being clamped down. We began to see a regularization of the media. We began to see how governments across the region was trying to control information and, the flow of information. And then we realized, okay, so it means that actually this COVID-19 is just further sort of, exposing the already systematic and the already embedded sort of, systems that are traditionally used to shut up people. And in that sense, then we realize what we need to do is to really put together a multifaceted strategy that will take care of not only the health and conditions of people, and not only, try and prevent death and preserve life, but also go deeper and begin investigating actually how some people were already taking advantage of the COVID situation to further manipulate and further their goals and further their interests and personal interests at various levels, of the economy. So this is what this strategy is all about. So I'll just go step by step. So one of our supports that we provided was obviously around information dissemination and awareness raising. And here, just at the beginning of the strategy, of the pandemic, what we wanted to do was to make sure that the very marginalized people to the very ends of societies also were receiving this information about COVID. If you remember the way information about COVID-19 started coming in, it was trickling in very slowly. And there are some people who heard about it early enough, and some people did not hear it, early enough. And so what we wanted to do, we wanted to see if we could equalize the access to information around what this COVID-19 was and what it was all about, and how people could indeed begin to protect themselves. And like I said, our main concern was the marginalized groups, the groups of people which ordinarily states and even private sector, those seeking to make money, would not think of, because they would not pay for that information. So groups like, informal settlers, sex workers, children, rural community, all these people were quite kind of our concern. So to achieve this, what we did was that, we actually supported the dissemination of credible information in languages that could be understood by all across the region. So basically our partners would come back and simply, ask us through proposals and so forth for translation of information in their own languages. And of course, country to country, they knew better which languages to use. And so we supported that. We also supported, of course, the production of posters, flyers, billboards, TV and radio production, airtime, and things like that. And very quickly, we also went into the area of research and some knowledge products, so that as OSISA, we could also sort of have some sort of information and own our own narrative around what was going on around COVID. If you remember, the narratives were really quite many. When it started, many people talked about so many things. No, it only affects you this time, maybe in the heat. It dies during it dies with heat. So when it gets warmer, it will disappear. Others started manufacturing within their backyards, some sort of remedies around how to prevent it or even cure it. So it was a whole lot of information, and we thought that it was very important that people who would not necessarily be able to reach information easily were given the right narrative about, the pandemic. Secondly, we also wanted to ensure that we strengthen access to testing and treatment for all. So one of the things we realized was that in this sub-region, the pandemic exposed gaps in our health services, health care systems, just as it was at global level. Most of them were kind of overburdened and overwhelmed, especially at the time when the COVID-19 really hit the peak. So in response to this, what we did as OSISA was to support trainings and capacity building efforts of health workers to ensure that they were skilled to efficiently manage, the cases, whilst protecting their own lives. This was very key for us. So we partnered with, institutions like medical schools, departments, hospital departments, hospital primary care facilities and departments, schools and so forth, where we made sure that we supported, the overall infection control as the first, sort of a line of response. So in this case, we were able to provide things like, personal protective clothing to health workers so that they could do their work, without fear. These were included things like masks, sanitizers, overalls, face shields, glasses, whatever you name it. It all depended on what the partner asked and what the specific hospitals needed, in those areas. For some countries that we deemed really deserving, we also went ahead and even provided, bigger hospital medical equipment, such as beds and mattresses, ventilators, oxygenators, and other accessories. This was, of course, in response to the overwhelming, pressure that was coming from the pandemic, which in some hospitals and which in some countries meant that there were actually absolutely no more bed spaces, left in the health centers. So we did that, and in many countries, this really helped to sort of cushion, that overwhelming, pressure on the hospital beds and equipment. And of course, we also supported the rollout of mental health services for frontline workers, recognizing the fact that they were experiencing a lot of pressure, many of them dealing with, unprecedented rates, death rates, which they had never, experienced before in their lives, just for them to remain, sane as well and in the right state of mind. So yeah, this also really, I think, helped the pandemic. At least the reports that we are getting now is that this was very useful also to include that psychosocial sort of counseling aspect to our support. And the third really was promoting information democracy, transparency, and accountability. As you remember, the COVID pandemic also saw the dissemination of the private media, leaving the state media well entrenched. So one of the things we are really concerned as OSISA is to make sure that, information that goes out, is sort of balanced. But you saw, like I said in my introduction, how the pandemic, in some cases, actually supported sort of the clamp down of certain, information and media, in the region. So what we did was that we wanted to go out flat to support the alternative media, so that we could ensure that the information going out in society and out there was balanced. And so in order to provide citizens with unbiased information and promote trustworthy news sources, we then saw a need for us to even, support further, independent and investigative journalism. Because if you remember when the pandemic hit, we were found in a situation where, especially in terms of numbers and rates of infection, some countries actually decided to sort of hide those statistics. And we realized that, the more these statistics are hidden, the more danger, citizens would be put, because we will not know the rate at which the pandemic was spreading. I think you and I will agree that, in the end, countries like Tanzania really suffered, greatly as a result of, states not communicating the truth about, the infection rate, or even keeping information away from citizens on what was COVID and what it was really about. In fact, in that country, you were not even allowed to wear a mask. If you were found wearing a mask, you were told you were arrested or something crazy like that. This all goes to show how some type of narrative, agenda or interest they may want to push, from their side. Hello, can you hear me?
Yes.
Okay, great. No, I received something popped up saying my network is unstable. So because of this, really, this particular piece of work was about supporting campaigns on digital rights, which meant that we are also promoting access, availability, and affordability of the internet to empower marginalized communities also to be able to tune in and understand what was happening around the COVID, pandemic. We also, our work around investigative journalism went about to ensure that, there was some fact-finding missions which came back with, the truth about, scientific truth about the pandemic. And this really helped to sort of counter falsehoods around the pandemic and then empower citizens with truthful accounts of events affecting their lives. We think that that was very important, because even if the governments across the region were not able to do anything about the pandemic at the time, we saw that this would empower citizens, those who were able to, at least to protect themselves, even if it just means staying at home. I think that we thought that that was important. So this is why we spent quite a great deal of money, investing in this information bit of the COVID strategy. Then the other part, the other intervention, major intervention that we undertook as OSISA was also in the area of preparedness, domestic financing, transparency, and accountability. So the big question that I think came on the scene when COVID-19 hit was, okay, fine, we've seen the UK, they are prepared, some, rich countries like the UK, America, the West generally, Europe, they were able to procure, additional, health equipment. Some of them were able to even build new hospitals within a very short time. These are cases like in Asia, where complete new buildings were built just to ensure that the pandemic was being managed and managed effectively, and just also to prevent further infection and so forth. But looking back in our region, we realized that we had no capacity whatsoever to do the sort of thing that we were seeing at, in the other regions, in the other parts of the world. And so the question was, how prepared are we, in terms of financing, especially even in terms of space, in terms of human resource, because we all know that our hospitals are always under-resourced and financed. So now, as the COVID hit, are we going to be able to really, sort of hold the pandemic to the extent that we should? So those were big questions for us. And so this was also sort of, it was also sort of linked to the state of our, what can I say, to the state of our political economic positions, really. We know we have a history of state corruption and indebtedness. We also have a history of lack of transparency, accountability in the utilization of any kinds of funds. And so the question was, are we going to be able to stand truthfully as a region, and respond to this pandemic? So because of, the history, of most of our governments in the region, we worried that, even if today somebody gave us COVID money, perhaps there would be a lot of questions again around how that money would be used. So as a result, we decided to support the rollout of tools that supported, various countries, various NGOs in monitoring the utilization of COVID funds, especially. But also we wanted to influence how, governments could then allocate sufficient money to the response of the COVID pandemic. Not only that, we also wanted to influence the decisions that were being made at cabinet around, in the various cabinets around, what the real direction of budgets, their own existing budgets, to try and combat the pandemic in a big manner. But there were also other socio-economic issues, as you know, such as people losing businesses and so forth. So all that was a big question for us around, preparedness, domestic financing, transparency, and accountability. So we supported a lot of these funds to try and monitor and just ensure that, the little that would have been, accumulated from either local budgets or from outside donations were sort of used very efficiently and effectively. So we supported quite a number of, NGOs across the region with tools to be able to demand, track, and demand accountability and the way these resources were being used. I can give you an example of my country where I'm sitting now in Zambia, we supported the development of the COVID-19 Fund Monitor in order to monitor the state's transparency and accountability in response to the COVID-19 outbreak. And in some cases, we also wanted to demonstrate that we are not just asking and demanding, but that we are also standing, side by side with government, and we are ready to support them where we could. And so because of that, we did also pour out, hard cash sort of resources to ensure that, countries also were supported in one way or another to curb the pandemic, save lives, and also in some ways sort of continue with economic activities. The other intervention that we made, I can't remember now whether this is the fourth or fifth intervention, but it was about mitigating the socio-economic effects of COVID on states and citizens. I think I have sort of mentioned this already in one or another, but it was all about protecting economies and livelihoods. With the advent of lockdowns and so forth, we saw that, women, especially informal traders, could not go out on the streets to do their daily businesses. Many of them would earn their livings, from, the sort of spaces that would not necessarily protect them from, protect them from catching COVID-19. And unfortunately, these are the people in the lower brackets of the economy. And just one day of not going out there, on the street to sell their products means, that they'll probably not have a meal on that day. We were concerned, for example, also about cross-border, traders who ordinarily would cross borders on a daily basis to earn a livelihood. And with the advent of shutting down borders, it meant that they could no longer work. And as you and I know that the pandemic went on for months, and now we are into a year. And what that means is that people would then be trapped behind the borders and will not be able to go out to do their work and earn their living in that sense. So as a result of this, we gave out a various number of interventions. So we supported initiatives that called for the right for workers to work in a healthy environment, for example, especially those that we knew that just by going out, it means a huge risk to catching COVID. We also advocated for the provision of state social protection support systems, especially in heavily affected populations. So if you saw in South Africa, the South African government was able, for example, to provide food rations to people who were, categories of people who had to be locked out of the street or any kind of work. But we are also calling on other governments as well to do that and to think around that, so that, people would remain healthy even when they are locked out of their normal businesses. We called out for the protection of laborers, casual workers, and same-skilled persons from exploitation during the emergency, because we were receiving reports such as, some companies locking out, their employees for weeks to months. And these employees were locked out from going to their families because the employers feared that if they went out there, when they come back, they would come back with COVID. But also the bigger fear was actually losing, the labor from these workers. And so for some of them, the best solution was to keep them completely locked down. And this was in places where there were no bed spaces ordinarily. There were no proper sanitation facilities, because the facilities were not prepared for that. And so we saw how, information began coming out around the exploitation that was going on in this kind of companies. So we started calling out on that and also alerting states and governments around this behavior in cases where they did not know about, and also pointing out those situations in order to ensure that, there was some kind of a mitigation measures coming from the state to support these workers that found themselves in this situation. So what we did also was to sort of chart the pathway to a new economic reality. Because what we realized was that now we'll never probably go back to the same situations. Our economies will not come back to the same order they were after the pandemic. A lot of things by then would have been the way we gather around what did this mean for the economic growth of our region. So our analysis actually showed that COVID-19 had exposed the region's social sector and the public sector service delivery. And in supporting this, what we did was to promote innovations and advocacy that looked into developing robust and sort of resilience education and health systems, which could efficiently deliver equitable and sustainable universal care to all, within COVID, during COVID-19 and after COVID-19. So one of the things we did was to take advantage of the COVID-19 pandemic to try and redefine what an economy, what, for example, a social service would look like after the pandemic, one that would sort of stand, one that would sort of be resilient enough and robust enough to sort of stand any kind of, pandemic, any kind of disaster now and after the pandemic. So in many countries, we began discussing, things around regional funding baskets for financing longer term, not just for the, COVID-19 period, but longer term, for example, health and education systems that we know that will stand even after the pandemic. For example, we have started now, and this support is still live, we have started now pushing, for example, for the access to internet, facilities and things like that, where we want to ensure that, schools going forward will be better equipped to sort of use internet as an alternative, for example, to teaching and so forth, so that regardless of what happens, we will be ready to do our work. Finally, what we also realized was that COVID-19 was quickly affecting our human rights defense work. So we saw a diminishing of human rights due to increased securities and authority that was thrown in the name of, protecting citizens from catching the COVID-19 pandemic. I think I'm not doing so well on time. Like, I'm not even checking what's the time. Okay, I'm 7 minutes over, but I think it's because I started late. You can hear me, right?
Yes, you can.
Okay, yeah, no, I'm just concluding now. So obviously the COVID-19 pandemic exposed the absence of strong socio-economic and political pillars and policies that were, not people-centric in a sense, and that could easily be manipulated, and be used by, states to actually clamp down, human rights. It actually exacerbated the economic, women and human rights challenges that already existed across the region. And these are challenges that OSISA has been, trying to address for many, many years. And in some of, the places And in some of the thematics, OSISA had actually started making good progress. For example, if you look at the progress made around girl children education, women economic empowerment, and so forth, we were receiving reports that really, there was a lot of progress in many countries where, for example, girl education was not the first thought. It began to be a first thought, and we saw how states adopted various policies to ensure that women and girls equally were able to participate, at various levels, be it even just going to school. But then what we saw was that very quickly, the pandemic began to erode some of the gains that we had made over the years and decades because of how, states directed, people because of the directions really and guidance that were provided in order to prevent and protect people from COVID-19. So with a lot of worry, we began to see, for example, that the staying at home of girls actually began to lead to increased sexual harassment and sexual abuse. For us, we mourned that because we began to see that now we are going backwards and we were going to quickly lose, some of the gains that we had, we plowed, over the years. So as a result, our response extended to initiatives that were aimed at protecting and safeguarding women's rights against gender-based violence, like I said, protecting, promoting, and upholding human rights in various spaces and ways. Journalists were one of those that we helped most specifically as well. Documenting also and seeking legal redress for ongoing human rights violations. And we saw them all over the region. Around how people for no reason would just be stopped, arrested for loitering and stuff like that. And we felt that this was really excessive and it was not necessary. We also advanced efforts targeting the marginalized, especially the vulnerable populations, and groups at high risk, such as women and children, the disabled, and so forth, even prisoners, to ensure that they too, were getting a fair share of protection, and were also being, minded by states, in the whole area of preventing and protecting people from COVID-19. So very quickly, I'll just move to some of the challenges that we faced as an NGO in trying to respond to the COVID-19 together with our partners across the region. So the first one was really around the procurement of personal protective equipment. It was very difficult to do that and to be able to respond in good time. As you know, the COVID-19 pandemic was something that you needed to respond very quickly, within hours, just for you to be able to save lives and so forth. But then we experienced that there was a very high demand, of these kind of supplies, especially bigger equipment like, ventilators and so forth across the region, mainly because of the huge demand of these products, especially in more well-to-do countries that were able to procure them, very easily than the poorer countries in the region. But there was also a lot of bureaucracy where we thought that states would act very quickly because, they appreciated the need for these products. We were still met with so much bureaucracy in the procurement, and this really delayed, the process. And there was not much we could do about it because, our colleagues, our partners, the local NGOs, they don't run hospitals. Whatever we had to do, we had to work with hospitals that are run by government. And so we just had to sort of succumb to their bureaucracy to just make sure that things were done in order. There was also corruption around the same PPE, procurement and distribution. And it became a major challenge really across the board, where you think that, you have helped people, and the very people you are helping, the very health workers, begin to play around with the products that you have provided, meaning that the products were not able to reach the intended, beneficiary in the end at 100%. And then, of course, it has been the steady increase of COVID-19 itself, which has not only forced us to continue, supplying, this equipment, but also has sort of forced us to totally divert from some of the, priorities that we had as an institution, some of the priorities that our NGOs had. I mean, the level of infections, were something, at some point, it was something that we could not catch up with. The fatalities, that accompanied the infections sort of were just giving a very hopeless, sort of picture, demoralizing a lot of people, and, in the process, sometimes losing the very sort of workers, frontline workers that were so important for curbing the infections and deaths themselves. Yeah, dealing with frustrated citizens and having lost livelihoods also proved to be a challenge. Many citizens were torn between survival and observing the strict COVID-19 restrictions. I think I talked about this earlier on, which was really a dilemma. And people at the time started asking questions: should we just sit and die out of hunger, or risk going out there to catch COVID, but at least we'll have food for today? So those were serious sort of challenges for us, and which could not just easily be resolved just like that. In some places, I think the issue was also around duplication of efforts, because initially it was very difficult to coordinate, amongst NGOs and even with government, private sector. Everybody sort of scampered in different directions. And sometimes we found ourselves again in the same space, overcrowding the same spaces in trying to respond to the pandemic. And sometimes this did not help very well. Again, in some places, states were reluctant, for example, to share sort of the COVID-19 national plans, where our NGOs could then support and rally behind. I think it only took quite after some time for governments to start opening up and letting in NGOs to participate freely, and also to sort of give their insights and provide their insights around how the country could direct their efforts in responding to COVID-19. But all these delays meant that the infection rates were spreading and people were dying. I think that there are many more we can share, but for the purposes of this meeting, I'll leave it here. And our major lesson learned, of course, as an organization, was actually the issue of flexibility, agility, and the ability to adapt to new ways of working. It was very critical, not only to ensure, that we responded to this pandemic in a timely manner, but also to ensure that the resources were efficiently, sort of directed. Of course, the very fact that our partners were not able to go out to do also work, sort of opened our eyes to around alternative ways of working, where now, a number of our partners had to work through online platforms just to deliver even the very messages around COVID-19. So all these were kind of lessons. There are many more, but I will leave it here for now due to time. And with this, I have come to the conclusion of my presentation. I do hope that it was helpful, and I'm available, I think, to some questions for about 20 minutes because I need to jump off to another meeting. But I'm throwing back to you, Dr. Ade, and I would like to thank you once again for providing OSISA with an opportunity to share, our insights and our journey with COVID-19. I must say that we are still learning and we are still looking for new alternatives, and innovating around how best to respond to the pandemic. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much, Mrs. Caroline. We enjoyed your presentation, to be very candid, and it's always very interesting to listen to stakeholders in NGOs, because actually you people have the direct connection with societies, with communities, unlike donors and even the government. NGOs are physical in most communities. So it is very, very important that we hear from you and the kinds of perspective you've given to us at this point. And before I open the platform for discussion, I would want you to answer some of my own personal questions. I'm quite inquisitive about the positionality of NGOs during the COVID-19 pandemic. And in my question, I will really want to understand the position of the NGO vis-a-vis the ineffectiveness of government response. Do you think NGOs are gradually becoming a substitute face for government institutions in Africa? Because when you see NGOs like OSISA and some other NGOs playing very important roles that ordinarily government should play, do you think we are getting to a point where African governments are becoming what I call para-governments or para-states, and NGOs are actually becoming very key players with respect to sorting the problems or challenges of healthcare delivery? Then I also want to ask you a very important question as regards to how do you think NGOs like OSISA try to reconcile interests? Because when you have NGOs that are funded by the West, clashing with governments in Africa, like you provided an example of what we had in Tanzania when the Tanzanian government was in denial of COVID, and the president at that point, Magufuli, was saying that one of the reasons why he did that was because he feels Africa will become much more vulnerable if we open the borders to the Chinese and to the West. So how do you think, what do we see as NGO stance? How do you reconcile the interest of the West and the interest of African states in Africa? So that is very important for us to know. You should know we are social scientists and we deal with some of these very critical issues. Then we also have this very important issue that was raised in the morning. We heard from health experts, especially scientists who are quite skeptical about the viability of indigenous knowledge systems. So we asked them questions, for instance, about the Madagascar organic and why some of them saw the Madagascar organic as conspiracy and not as a science. So do you think we can have NGOs at some point on the continent that would propel or that would popularize the viability of our indigenous knowledge systems in solving real problems in our local communities, where we don't have to depend on foreign science? When I say foreign science, is to also unpack what we call science as not entirely global. So how do you think NGOs like your NGO can propel local initiatives? So I wanted to answer those three questions before we take other questions in the Q&A session.
Okay, so your first question was around NGOs becoming a substitute of states or governments around them, the region or even around the world. Well, NGOs are not supposed to become substitute. Indeed, the challenges that states face are overwhelming. And what we do as NGOs is to recognize that, certain states, not only do they sort of have limited resources around, trying to address challenges of this, the right sort of skill or sufficient skill to be able to follow up on certain, issues, so that, for example, when they are providing, responses and they're providing, services to their citizens, they are not doing it from sort of an uneducated point of view, but they are doing it from a very knowledgeable point of view. And we know that because if they do it from a very knowledgeable point of view, then the citizens will be secure. They will not be at risk of many other things. So the collaborative efforts we try as NGOs to have with government are the type where we try to support governments to actually achieve their agenda in a specific country. Of course, many may argue that certain NGOs are sponsored by certain other funders to perhaps distract or divert the agenda of local states or of local governments, in one way or another. But I must say that there's a lot of NGOs coming from a lot of different sources. And I think that is the point of departure. So certain monies that I raised through NGOs, they come from individuals like you and me. And those individuals do not necessarily have an agenda of whether it's to take over government or to substitute. The agenda they have is to sort of alleviate the poverty situations, alleviate the conditions that they see in these countries, because they feel that they are sitting in a very privileged, space, and they feel that if they gave perhaps 10% of their income towards, a child in Africa, towards a health care post in Africa, life would be better for those people than it is now. So because of that, you find that such people or such donors, as we would want to call them, they rarely have sort of hidden motives, in terms of trying to direct or even try to influence how government or states do things. And this kind of support really, or aid, can as well be done from local level. It's only that as, Africa especially, we have not yet learned, the art of resource mobilization amongst ourselves. And when we do that, we are able to support, other people who are privileged. So the site is the kind of aid that we do in Africa. You find it moves, especially around the lines of extended family, where I see, my cousin, this was my uncle's child or my auntie's child. Okay, fine. So I have 3 meals a day. I have extra money even after I have paid school fees. Perhaps the little money that I have, I can also help them and extend that support to ensure that they also get an education. So we do that very well, but usually it moves within, sort of families, the extended family. We never get to a level where we think, okay, so if my brother has, let's say $10, but I have a little bit more, I have 20, and I don't have the idea of supporting another person. But if my brother came to me and said, okay, but you actually have $20 extra, why don't we put it together and we can make life better for these, our relatives or our community? This is something where we don't appreciate our social capital. And so because of that, and maybe saying we don't is too much, because I know that Africans of course, we help out each other a lot, but maybe we have not come up with a systemized way for my cousin. So what am I saying around substituting government's effort? I'm saying government, NGOs come in to complement where we see that states and governments are not able to, and they are struggling. The private sector does pretty much the same, except the private sector has got, of course, that extra need for them to make profit. But we come in because we are philanthropic and we are not seeing any, we are not in requirement of any opportunity to make any profits. because that is how our money is defined. So if you think about a region where, schools are few, a private sector will go in there and say, okay, those who can pay, let them pay, but I'll provide the service which government is failing to provide in that area. But an NGO will come in and say, okay, we will build the school as long as perhaps if government can provide us with the teachers and school materials and so forth, and then we'll be able to address a need in that area. So we are finding ourselves now as NGOs in a locality where maybe for 30 years after independence, government has not been able to provide a school in there, but we are there, we have provided the school. So the number one, of course, motivation for NGOs on the ground is to be able to supplement government, because we are not a government, and so we are not even able to support a good percentage of the population from their resources. Perhaps they will just be in one town or one province or one state of that particular country, because they do not have the resources, but they do have resources enough to change a situation for a particular group of people. So because of that, it's almost impossible to say that NGOs can, overtake government or indeed substitute government. The second role we play is indeed to be, co-thinkers with government. There are certain things where perhaps because NGOs are smaller and because they have more concentrated resources, they are able to think around things very quickly. They are also able to do research work and things like that to inform a specific or a particular kind of situation, and able to share with the government to say, look, we have researched on this matter, and we think that the reason why, even though you have built a school, for example, you still don't have girl children in the school, is because you have not gone deeper to analyze the factors that are surrounding the absence of girls from school. So we can share that sort of information where government, because they are government, for them to do that kind of research, they'll probably have to do it for the entire country because they are mandated to do that. But NGOs have the freedom to, go around and pick lessons and pick, practices and understand more intimately groups of people than government would be able to. And there, then we begin to complement government's knowledge around certain issues. The third one is around the issue of ensuring that, government is accountable and transparent in the way that we do things. Now, as a continent, we have been looped into, democratic governance. Democratic governance means that, we have to be open about the way we do things. It means that we have to be transparent, it means that we have to be accountable. Because once we have adopted this modern way of doing things, which one can argue, yes, came from the West again, it means that we are no longer chiefdoms. We are not managed by a chief who can do anything they wish, towards their people. We are now managed by systems and legislation. We are managed by, laws. We are managed by structures and so forth. All of those structures that we need to abide by in order for us to promote good governance and accountability. So the third role, therefore, of NGOs is for us to be able to be out there and support government to ensure that there's good governance. Now, we all know the story around how this goes in Africa, not too well. So because then when we come in and say, look, we think that you could have procured, this set of medicines or this set of equipment in a cheaper way and in a more transparent way, what then comes out is a misconstruction that NGOs are trying to fight government or counter government. But actually, it's because NGOs, we have learned over the years that corruption, lack of accountability and transparency has led to our countries being at the mercy of the few elites, economic elites and political elites. Some of them are actually private sector. They may not even be government. And sometimes because government is not able to do their research very, very well, they'll be sitting here and right in the corner of the country, resources. And we want to demand for accountability from such people as well, because we know that only when these resources, these kind of resources are used in a prudent manner, will we be able to spread the benefits of the country to many more other people, within the country. So those are just a few examples that I have given. But I mean, if we are talking about the direct question of, are we trying to be a substitute? We cannot. I think it's not possible, at least now, to be able to substitute government as NGOs. So you said also, how does NGOs reconcile their interests? Funding from, from the West, which is sort of clashing. Yeah, I hope I got that question correctly. How do NGOs reconcile our interests with government, because we are also funded by the West? That's what you are asking, isn't it? And that government is also funded by the West. So it's kind of like I explained earlier. It's the main reason for NGOs, at least unless that NGO has ill intentions. And my hope, of course, is that sooner or later they will be exposed. There are very few NGOs that come on the scene to be registered by governments, by states themselves. And in the process of doing a registration of an NGO, you usually have to go through very stringent sort of scrutiny around what exactly have you come to do in the country, and what exactly are you offering to support, and how exactly are you promising to change the situation or turn around the situation for our people. And NGOs need to answer those questions very well. You also need to prove and show that you have a good constituency base that will be able to support, to say, yes, this NGO is not doing one thing during the day and doing another thing in the night. And so ourselves, the whole issue around transparency and accountability, it must start with us. It must start with us, even if it means people are giving out, used clothes from Oxfam and so forth, and those used clothes are supposed to be given to poor kids of Africa. There should be transparency in the way those clothes are distributed, because we don't want them to end up at just one person's home and only their children are benefiting from those clothes. So because of that, the registration is stringent. And for me, just from the extent this NGO has come on the playground, they are coming out to support, and complement efforts of government. Now, there have been some arguments around, okay, so in their own right, so that they secure jobs and so forth. I think the truth of the matter is that money could, if it was channeled to government, I guess the same money would be used in the same way. The only thing that donors do is to try to balance. So if the British government is giving money towards government, and indeed much of the money, like much of the budgets that come from bilateral funding, such as DFID, USAID, goes into mainline government initiatives. So government is also receiving funding and aid, like you said. But the donors are also concerned that they must be able to provide alternatives to the way the support is.
I think there's a break in transmission. Mrs. Caroline, if it's possible, you can switch off your video so that we can have unhindered access to you, if it's possible. So I guess she has logged out. So we'll have her back to intervene on some of the issues we're raising. And participants, you can still send your questions so we can ask her when she comes in later. Maybe for now we can just wait for a few minutes to see how well she handles the problem on the side. Thank you.
Hello? Hello? Hello?
Hello.
Hi, Doctor. I
Miss
lost
Caroline,
you
are you back
somewhere.
online?
Yes, I'm back. I don't even remember
so I can
where
see
I dropped.
online, but we're still waiting to hear from her. Miss Caroline, are you back?
Yes, I'm back. Can you hear me?
So while we wait on her, okay, can you hear me now?
I can hear you, but it seems like you can't hear me.
Yes, I can hear you now, loud and clear.
Oh, you can hear me now. All right. Okay, perfect.
So you have
it's really, I had to connect through the phone because my laptop, I think it's giving more challenges to connect than the phone. So yeah, I'll try to hold it for a while. Not sure where I lost you from. I don't know where I was when I got cut off. Hello? I can't hear you. You are muted. I can't. Okay.
Yes. Sorry about that. You were trying to answer the question as regards how NGOs reconcile the interest of African state government and that of donor agencies, especially donor agencies that fund NGOs in Africa.
Yeah, and so what I was trying to say is that, look, you know, donors have a choice to give all of the aid to governments. They do have that choice. And indeed, the majority of money that comes, one of the things that we normally don't know as a people is that actually the majority of the money that comes through from the donors is actually going to governments, to states. There are very few governments around, especially Africa, that would willingly deny that sort of support. So if you look at USAID, you look at the Netherlands government, you look at Swedish Corporation, you look at the Danida and their money, UK aid and all that, 80% of it goes to government. So what do these donors do? They decide maybe to preserve around 20 to 30% of their budget, and that money is distributed to major NGOs and civil society in general, in the recipient countries. Why are they doing that? They know that the money that they have given to government, right? 80%, around 80% of budgets. And that is just one of the reasons. Government will not be able to hold themselves accountable. So of course, government will put in place, committees, regulatory bodies, and all this kind of stuff, right? Which ensures the donor that money is going to be safeguarded, but it's not guaranteed. And also, when they do that, if NGOs don't receive, civil society does not receive any of that funding, it means that the only narrative that citizens will be hearing is that of the state and the government. So how do you balance that narrative? You must at least have an alternative voice. But if NGOs are not given money, civil society is not given any resources, it means that we cannot go out there and, effectively gather evidence that we can then use now to say, oh, look, we were actually given so much money by USAID, and this money was supposed to build a school, a hospital, or procure equipment here and there, but this hasn't happened. What happened to the money? So, of course, government will do that. I mean, in my country, there was a time when I think the UK aid gave money around what we call social protection. What do we call that? Anyway, it's a social protection measure to citizens, particularly citizens who are not able to work, who are not able to get employment. And so that fund is simply supposed to sort of give them that social security and that their lives can go on. And then sooner or later, we discovered that actually this money had been diverted, very well diverted by the state to do other things, of political elites, economic elites, diverted completely. And so what we did, civil society picked it up and made noise and said, look, even the Auditor General's report is showing that this money was totally diverted. And so what did government say? Their first reaction was that, no, we can actually give you back that money. It's there in the account. It's sitting in that account. Now imagine a situation where UK aid had given this money to the country so that this money can be given to citizens who are in vulnerable situations. But the response to government was that it was sitting in the account. So why was it sitting in the account if this money was supposed to have been given to citizens to support their livelihoods? But in the whole of that fracas, in the end, some people ended up getting fired. And the question was, why are you firing people if the money was just sitting in the account? You understand? So it's those kind of things where donors also realize that, look, for us to be able to promote real development and to promote equitable development in these countries, we need alternative voices and narratives. And this is why I'm giving you that answer, because if you see the way I have apportioned the money, the 80% and 20%, the issue of really competing there for donor funds is almost not there, because civil society usually just waits for this envelope to land on us, and then whoever competes for it within now civil society is the one that gets, sort of the contracts to do those kind of work. But I just also wanted to tell you that there is money, donor money, which is not necessarily in competition, So if you think of money like from Bill Gates Foundation, Ford Foundation, people like us, OSISA, this is money that comes from one individual, a rich individual that has decided that before they die, they're going to try and make a difference in the world. They're going to try and make the world a better place. And so they identify areas, they work with locals like us to really find out where will our money make the most investment. So, the investment make the most, change. So we work with them, and there when you look at this kind of money, there's very little political interest there. Because the only political interest is if, for example, as OSISA, we are pushing an agenda that is negative for that country. And if that agenda is negative for that country, like I said, sooner or later, civil society itself will come back to us and say, no, OSISA, actually what you are doing, you are even going against our culture. You are even going against our ABCD. We don't want your money anymore, things like that. And so ourselves, again, we have mechanisms actually when we work where we empower communities that should we ever be found ourselves in a situation which is questionable, people should be able to question us. But normally our work is centered around, when you look at open society, all what that means is that we are promoting voices in the different localities of the continent, so that those voices can be heard, so that development can be seen from the perspective not only of the government, but also from the perspective of the people. So that's what we mean when we say we want to open up. We don't want a situation where things are hidden. We want everything to come on the surface, because why? It's public money. If it's your private money, yes, we don't have any business with it because you can deal with it. But also if it's your private money and you're exploiting people in the process of getting that money, then sooner or later we'll come around to it and we'll challenge you. Yeah, so I hope that has answered the question around NGO and government interests. And then the third one was around the viability of indigenous health systems. Yes, this is very important to us. And like I said, what donors, donors, there are good donors in this world. And what they have done, they have seen that, look, all the time when, for example, even a particular type of medicine is required, Africa has to wait for big pharmaceutical companies, in the West to decide what medicine this Africa needs. So they will come, do research in our country, they'll come, get people, our people, and they'll be part of that research. They'll even come and get the same products that are required to respond to that, for example, medicine that is required. And the question is, okay, if these Africans have been living for decades, most of them without even the slightest access to a modern healthcare system, we want to find out how have they been living healthy all these years? Because the assumption is that if you are not close to a proper healthcare system, you are going to die, because only medicine can save your life. But we've saved our own lives for many years. So this is something that OSISA does very well. For example, right now, we are supporting a research in Madagascar. You did mention Madagascar, right? Where, we are trying to protect, research that is going on there. So whenever we have an opportunity to hear of or learn about a certain group of people or a certain group of institution trying to pour money towards, the discovery of a certain medicine and so forth, we pour money in there. We've poured a lot of money, for example, in the DRC itself, in the research of Ebola and so forth, and supporting that doctor along the way. From the time that he started researching around that, there were many times that he was neglected. But along the way, when OSISA had come, on board, we did support some aspects of his work. And there we go. We now have, an Ebola, sort of cure in the country. So we do that. That is just an example. And then we not only do that, we promote. And one of the things, if you may not know what was happening around that Ebola, was that actually one of the doctors, I think it's in France or Belgium, wanted to claim that as his own formula, as being the one who actually discovered the cure. But one of the things we did at OSISA also was to protect, the ingenuity of, that product, so that we made sure that, that credibility, that patent was not taken away from Africa, but instead it was protected, and the rightful owners were able to claim a credit over what they were able to achieve. So it's not only that, and sometimes we do a lot of this work. Some of it succeeds, some of them doesn't really succeed, but we are happy to be trying because we really, really want to support indigenous products and promote indigenous healthcare systems. Yes. So if you look at countries like India in the Asia where we support, we do a lot of that kind of work because, as you know, India is very good at self-sustaining health systems. Yeah. I think that was the last question, and I hope I have answered at least
yes.
even just part of it.
No, you've answered it so well. I like the way you answered the third question specifically. So let me ask some questions. Let me just read some questions out so that you can attend to them. So this is from Prof. Mishindo. He's the director of the Rhodes University African Studies Center. So he thanks you for this very great presentation. He would like you to highlight if OSISA reflected on the impact of COVID-19 on the welfare of women and children in Southern Africa. Is there any data that speaks to that as yet? He wants to know that. Then we also have a question from an anonymous attendee who wants to know how effective the initiatives flagged off by OSISA as regards the pandemic, and now their statistics and are there statistics to show the achievements you've outlined, especially on job security. So she's really interested about the kinds of work OSISA has done in respect of job security during the pandemic. So those two questions are still yet to be answered.
Okay, I'll start with the last one, the job security, because it's still quite fresh in our minds. So for example, one of the things we did with the rising of the pandemic, I think it also meant that economies were really being affected. But we knew already that in some countries like Zimbabwe, we were already sitting on very systematic, well-structured systems that would ordinarily oppress and exploit workers. So one of the things we have been doing is working with the teachers there, teachers unions and so forth, to use the COVID-19 moment, because we realize that as much as COVID-19 is a negative, trend, in some ways it has provided an opportunity for us to be able to go deeper into the interrogation of why certain things have remained the way they are, or why certain things have even become worse. So what we did, we used this moment because now teachers were able, through just the need to speak about reopening of schools, for example, and the protection that went around reopening of schools and the security, the care that went around that. We then brought in bigger questions around, for example, the pay of teachers, because there were a lot of, implications that came from COVID-19 that were now affecting the pay of teachers. For example, in some schools, teachers now were being asked to do online classes, right? And government would just give a directive to say, go ahead and provide online learning or online classes, but without providing, data, without asking if this teacher actually had a computer or a phone even to be able to deliver those online classes. So we investigated, we did sort of, fact-finding missions, not really research, to understand what were the dynamics that were actually at loggerhead with some of the demands that government was making. So we used that moment actually to sort of, what can I call, to ignite the voice of teachers. Because ordinarily before COVID, they were just sitting there. If the government is giving them $38 per month as their pay, they would just take it. Because what else could they do? They could not go to another country to teach. So we used that moment because everybody was alive to the fact that, COVID-19 is affecting us and so forth. And we used that moment to ignite the discussion around, teachers, their plight, their conditions, and around, the need for government to ensure that teachers' jobs and others were safeguarded, during and after the COVID-19 pandemic. So one of the things that started happening is that actually teachers now were able to organize themselves and even put up strikes. And at some moment, I think the government of Zimbabwe trying to threaten them to say, no, we'll fire all of you and what have you. Of course, it did not work. So eventually, yes, there may be some improvements. Yes, the teachers will not get everything. But what we have realized, and what they have also realized, is the power they have to be able to speak out on these things. And indeed, we were getting reports as OSISA where, some of the leaders of the teachers union and so forth were almost being abducted. Some of them were being threatened and so forth. But what that told us is that they have heard, the government has heard the message that teachers were sending, and we were there to facilitate. But what were we doing? We were igniting them so that they see that they cannot continue to tolerate this situation anymore. So what started as a need to just address COVID issues ended up being a need to address longer and systematic issues, that affect and surround a teacher's ability to teach, that surround their conditions and so forth. So in that sense, I can say that this is one example I can give in terms of job security. The other one has been some sort of more informal ones, where across the region, we have worked with NGOs and groups of people, women, youths, to identify sub-businesses or some enterprises that they could do. Some of them took advantage of the COVID-19, pandemic, but some of them simply was to find alternatives around how do we do things. Now we have been confronted with this. What is it that we can do so that in the future we don't find ourselves in this situation again? And I talked about the new economic realities earlier when I was making my presentation. So we invested a lot of money around there, where especially youths and women were supported to find alternatives. Some of those who have been thrown out of jobs as a result of the pandemic were actually given grants, startup capital, and things like that to be able to set up their own businesses or to be able to join together and promote a certain enterprise that would still enable them to, earn some income. Some of them just asked that they are sort of, supported to increase their sort of investment base so that they could sort of lift up or rise up from where COVID had taken them. Because for some, it meant that COVID had the many months of not selling, not trading, and so forth. They found themselves eating their capital and so forth. So they already had enterprises, yes. They already had jobs, yes. But the many years of not investing, reinvesting meant that they eroded their capital. So some of them simply came back and asked for that. And OSISA were able to support that. So in a sense, we're able to sort of protect their jobs. But also, it's also the advocacy, the high level advocacy that we have been doing, that where we speak to private sector, where we are trying to influence private sector and government in terms of how do they respond to the job situation of people, especially for people who have lost jobs. What is it that what we can do? What are the lessons that we have learned? And how are we going to plow them into future private sector endeavors and government endeavors to ensure that people do not necessarily lose jobs? So that is one area. Of course, the area around advocacy, we can only speak and sort of track the result. We have very little control over what will eventually happen. And some of these advocacy, initiatives are still going on up to this day. And also we continue to identify women, youths, and other groups that have been affected by the COVID. We continue actually to provide grants to people that have been affected by the COVID and lost their livelihoods and their economic basis, and trying to prop them up again. So yeah, I hope I have answered that question. And then highlight if we have, I do not remember if we have done a very specific research on women and children and how this has affected, you know, how COVID, has affected these groups. But I know that we have done a lot of fact-finding missions and evidence gathering around how, you know, the pandemic has affected the various groups of people, not only children, not only women, you know, but other groups, the disabled, you know, other, you know, trade, like I said earlier on, cross-border traders, you know, in different enterprises around the region. We have done that and we have gathered evidence. Quite a number of researchers now have started in many different directions that are related to COVID, but I cannot say for sure if these are really just focusing on women and children. But yes, we are doing that. And much of it has been really evidence building around situations and how then with that evidence building, we should be able to respond to those various situations. Yeah.
Thank you so much, Caroline. I appreciate you for giving that very detailed response. So now we have come to the end of this very interesting section. We want to appreciate you from here at the Rhodes University African Studies Center, and also we also want to appreciate you from the Institute of African Diaspora Studies there in Lagos. We are very, very excited to have you work with us on this very, very important project. Now I will hand over to Professor Innocent Mishindo, who is the director of the Rhodes University African Studies Center, who is the Dean of the Faculty of Humanities here at Rhodes University. So he'll round up the section with a closing remark. Thank you. Thank
you so much. Like I said, thank you for the opportunity. And I look forward to having more discussions with you. Thank you.
Thank you too.
Okay. Thank you so much, colleagues, for this opportunity. I'm receiving feedback from another microphone somewhere. Just pardon me for sure. Thank you very much. I would like to just make some few remarks on regarding this colloquium as we finish right now. It has been one of the key attempts by the humanities and social sciences to facilitate a discussion with the old scientists, policymakers, and NGOs on this important matter of COVID-19. We regret, of course, to note at this point, and I must say this, that the majority of the people in charge of strategic national health research and institutions in Africa are men. We do look forward to a time when women and girls can find more opportunities to advance their career paths, so that we do get to hear from them as well. Perhaps this could also result in deeper policies that are, in my view, earmarked to support or to assist women and children during times of health emergencies. I just felt I must highlight that. We did receive deep insights, colleagues, from the colloquia from the Nigerian Institute of Medical Research. I mean, from the chairperson of the Coronavirus Task Team for South Africa, from the African Union, and from the Lagos State Health Commissioner, and from OSISA. So taking into cognizance the deep stuff that we did share in these 2 days, we could not have asked for more, and I think our panel was duly and sufficiently constituted. But I want to make a few observations that could perhaps summarize this very deep colloquium of these last 2 days. Number one, that most of the coronavirus-related researches in Africa were largely donor-driven. That is what we found from this colloquium. Number two, that although most African governments did take a proactive stance to deal with the pandemic, the levels of financial input were largely stopgap, focusing largely on flattening the curve, and hence very strong statist approaches in terms of hard and soft lockdowns and also kinds of attempts at infodemics. Number three, further, that we are not aware, and I'll speak under correction, we are not aware of any claim to date about Africa inventing drugs or vaccines to deal with the virus. And consequently, as Professor Salim Abdul Karim observed, we become, I will quote his words, victims of vaccine nationalism. The fourth point I want to stress also is that there hasn't been sufficient consolidated engagement between medical science, as it is particularly known, and on the other hand, indigenous knowledge systems, as we tend to question it. This evidently speaks to the limits of what I would call at this point the coloniality of knowledge production, and how this has continued to influence present and future scientific mindsets and scientific procedures. In this connection, I'm happy that the NGOs like OSISA have in fact attempted to reach out to Madagascar in this respect, as we could have hear from Caroline, who spoke just now. So what does that reflect about Africa's positioning? All that I've just been saying now, what does it reflect about the continent's positioning in global health architecture? How could this weak positionality in world health system architecture be potentially remedied so that Africa gets to engage proactively in drug production more than it is actually importing? I believe the Commissioner of Health in Lagos did, of course, allude to the fact that in Nigeria, there was limited engagement between the states around this issue of the pandemic. If in one country such incoherences were evident, how then about the continental picture? We did hear of the great efforts of the African Union as Africa CDC and how they try to set up regional centers to support initiatives that were taking place in the different countries. There is a very serious lacuna, however, when it comes to having deeper engagement between the countries themselves, which I believe will only happen when we re-agenda Africa and stop the dependence syndrome and the beggar mentality that engulfs the continent, and consequently, which has robbed us as a continent of the mind to innovate and to provide solutions to our own challenges. Medical research institutes, colleagues, in Africa have generally been very strong in the early years of the post-colony. And this trend continued until the 1980s. I speak here as a historian. Perhaps I believe the historians will have to weigh into these discussions to say what went wrong and perhaps what may need to be done. The late 1980s saw a consolidation of a new world order that had obviously began in the 1970s with people called Margaret Thatcher and Ronald Reagan. The structural adjustments that were imposed on Africa by the West impacted on the overall levels of state support for critical entities as state subsidies were ultimately removed. In most cases, removed wholesale. So the question then is, how did this impact on medical research institutes? And I would like to perhaps challenge the audience here to think and to research around some of those issues. I believe that going forward, we may need to reassess ourselves in the post-neoliberal order to determine if there is a way to bounce back as a continent, because we are genuinely stuck in the mire. I don't want to use an unprintable word, but we are stuck in the mire. A key to that process, in my view, is to democratize the state and professionalize public entities and get them to rid of corruption and maladministration that have become the norm on the African continent. I believe this will create conditions for greater political and economic accountability. The trickle-down effect will be that we will be able to support health research and arrest the health brain drain that has plagued the continent for a long time. So the Africa CDC therefore noted the criticality for capacity building in Africa to produce vaccines. That is critical and that is important. However, I believe that practicalities of how this could be realized will need to be discussed more deeply. And perhaps a position or a policy paper may need to be developed by the Africa CDC so as to trigger further movement on this point, and so as to try to find if there will be political will on the part of the states that are very stuck on the notion of sovereignty and statist approaches to issues, even where it demands that the continent take a different approach. Further, there is an urgent need, I would say, to deepen collaboration with our fellows globally by using Africa as a launch pad, I would venture to say, for that, at least by getting the African Union to coordinate the opening up and funding of health research centers for excellence on the continent. In that way, we will be able to use Africa as a launch pad for new health initiatives. So I believe that the challenge goes back to the African Union to stand up and be counted and to see how the states could contribute towards an Africa Health Fund and health research funds that will try to probably resurrect our dead health research institutions. So it is tried to say that some of the scholars researching abroad in big pharmaceutical corporations are actually Africans, but they barely work closely with their compatriots based on the continent. So long Africa continues on that strong statist approach with that emphasis on the sovereignty of the state, which is often mistaken for nationalism, I believe we are going nowhere as a continent. I do argue then that consolidated work that goes beyond political boundaries are needed now. In that way, our successes, I believe, will be difficult to realize, and our engagement with other world will not happen unless we break down the statist approaches. I want to end this by an invitation to the contributors to this colloquium. Our colleagues, all of you, I will beg you, and I will communicate with you very soon. The African Studies Center is working on a book on COVID-19 and the state in Africa. And we do hope that presenters here will find it worthwhile to consider preparing their presentation, presentations which we found to be quite deep and welcome as individual chapters that could contribute together with some of the initiatives that we are doing as part of our call for papers to this book on COVID-19 and the state in Africa. We will forever, if any of you will not find this worthwhile, we will forever miss this kind of the very deep analysis that you were bringing to us, the statistics that you so aptly and painstakingly prepared. And I would venture to say, let's not become a part of the continued African problem. The problem of having information and not putting it down in memory so that it be used by generation to come and generations to come in developing particular policies and perspectives for purposes of dealing with this emergency that we are dealing with and that we are talking about. And therefore, your chapters will be considered for this book. I will contact you at some point. And to all our delegates, we are happy and we are glad that you were able to tune in and enjoy this time in the last few days that we have had to talk together. And thanks all the panelists, and thanks for all the delegates for very penetrating questions that you were inquiring. We do apologize, of course, for the connection glitches that some of you experienced, and maybe the time limits that we imposed on some of the sessions, but we do thank you, and thank you very much. Okay, we are done.
Thank you so much, everyone. Now we end the meeting.